Chapter 5: Black Civilization in Africa. Before we embark on our voyage into African civilization, I think that it would be interesting to the readers and students of African history to know how the continent of Africa received its name. First of all, in ancient periods, the Black Hebrews referred to Egypt, the guardian of the northeastern gate of Africa, as the land of Ham. The Hebrew ethnologists use the eponymous name Ham because they were conscious of the fact that many of Ham's descendants traveled from Asia toward the south and inhabited the continent we know of today as Africa. It seems that there were no Semites or Indo-Europeans in the land of Ham, Africa, before the enslavement of the Hebrews and the Hyksos invasion. Ancient Palestine was part of the land of Ham before the Hebrews came and expelled the Hamitic Canaanites. It appears that the early anthropologists and ethnologists classified races on the basis of cultural development and not on the basis of kinship, but the Hebrews are an exception. The early Greeks distinguished between Hellenes and barbarians because they wanted their own people to appear superior. Some of them claimed that they originated everything. The advanced Romans felt culturally superior to the northern barbarian tribes, and they enslaved many of these barbarians. The Egyptians subjugated and sold other African tribes that were inferior to them in culture, and they conceived of themselves as racially and culturally superior to other underdeveloped people. The Greek scholars took interest in Black people 600 years after the founding of Naucratis, a Greek colony on the Nile Delta. About 1 BC, the Greek historians Strabo and Diodorus classified the Ethiopian races, Black races in the interior of Africa. The Greeks received slaves from Upper Nile and west of the Nile, adjacent to the Ethiopian kingdom. Herbert Went quotes Aristotle, who says that the Pygmies came from the Upper Nile, which is Ethiopia. In much of Greek literature, in referring to the maps of Africa during the Middle Ages, show this continent as Ethiopia. Knowing that the greater part of Africa was called Ethiopia, the professor of zoology and anthropology, Johann F. Blumenbach, classified the human species into 5 categories: Caucasian, Mongolian, American Indians, Malaysians, and Ethiopians. Notice the father of modern anthropology does not use the term Negro, but Ethiopian. But the modern name of this continent is Africa. It is derived from the descendants of Abraham and Keturah. These descendants are Ophran or Aphor and Jophran. Following Ophran, the grandson of Abraham, through Keturah, led a military expedition against Libya and captured it. When his grandchildren colonized that place, they called it, from his name, Africa. In the Latin language, the word for Africa is Afar, which is similar to Afrin or Afar. The F in the word Afar and the PH in Afar are interchangeable in many languages. In North Africa, the Romans won a military victory, the period of the Third Punic War. Ostensibly, the Romans borrowed the word Afar from the ancient Libyans, who called their country Afar. The continent of Africa is a gigantic mass of land. Its land surface is almost 4 times larger than the United States. How and where did Africa receive its black population? Did it come from the south, the east, the north, the west, across the mighty oceans? Or did this population originate in the interior of the continent through a gradual process of evolution? Herbert Went and Basil Davidson say that it presumably came from Mesopotamia, Babylonia. The history of the ancient black Jews indicates that the early patriarchs of the African people migrated from Babylonia, but there is productivity, a proclivity among many scholars to bypass Jewish sources because of prejudice and to look elsewhere for the solution in the mythologies of the nations. Much truth has become lost in the worship of many gods and in the deification of many kings, or defecation of many kings. Can we put any credence in Jewish records that record the ethnology and migrations of the ancestors of the Africans? I think so, because Abraham came from the district of Babylon, which was the cradle of civilization. Abraham had the oral traditions transmitted from Noah and Shem. Abraham rendered obeisance to the one true God. Therefore, his descendants were able to transmit a long and uninterrupted religion, history, culture, and language. No other nation in the ancient Near East can boast or claim as much. Even as great as Egypt was, her ancient religion and language are now extinct. The Hamites began to arrive in Africa from the Middle East between 5000 and 3500 BC. These Hamites were, according to the Hebrews, Mizraim, Egypt, Put or Foot, Somaliland and westward, and Cush, Ethiopia. The Hamitic, Canaanite, Phoenicians did not colonize North Africa until the 9th century BC, when they established the city of Carthage at Tunis or Tunis. The Egyptians and their descendants are Ludim, Ananim, Lebanim, Naphtuim, Pathruism, Pathruism, Kash, Kashim, Philistine, and the Capharim, the Natulim settled in the Nile Delta, and Pathruis is the city of Pathros in Upper Egypt. Ananuim and Kashuim also settled in various sections of Egypt, but the Lebaim and Ludim occupied the territory west of Egypt, now called Libya, and on westward. Capthorim occupied the island of Crete in the Mediterranean Sea, and Philistine eventually inhabited the lower coast of Palestine. When the Israelites under Joshua ben Nun invaded the land of Canaan, many of the Hamitic Canaanite tribes migrated to North Africa. The Cushites inhabited East Africa along the coast and parts of the interior. More Ethiopians and black Semites crossed the Red Sea from the southern tip of Arabia and traveled into the interior of Africa. The entire continent of Africa was populated from the north and the east. Mary Hastings Bradley, during her journey through Tangikia, or Tangukia, excuse my pronunciations, relates a story of the experienced Watusi of Rwanda. She says they have an exact theology, the account of the creation of the world, and a tradition that they came down from the north. Also, Herman Norden writes about the people of Uganda having a legend of crossing the Nile centuries ago. Uganda is south of the Nile and east of the Congo. The third son of Ham is Put, sometimes written. The third son of Ham is Foot, sometimes written Put. The descendants of Put have been found in the entire area below the Sahara Desert. They use the names Futa, Fool, Fulas, Pool, Pool, Poolbay, or Pool, and Foolbay. These tribes have disseminated themselves across Africa from Somaliland to Senegal. Professor Godby says that they have prefixed their name to almost every district of any extent which they have ever occupied. They have Futa Toro near Senegal, Futa Jalu, and Futa Bandu to the north of Sierra Leone. There is also Futa Kasong, Futa Zora, Futa Fairlow, and Futa Duga. Egypt, the land of the Nile. The most extraordinary civilization in ancient times at the western extremity of the Fertile Crescent was that of Egypt. What conditions contributed to Egypt's greatness? The factors that made possible the eminence of these black people were the climatic conditions and geography. The conditions that played a great part in the development of Egyptian civilization were the Nile River, a hot climate, an outlet to the Mediterranean Sea and the Red Sea. Egypt is the Nile. A very peculiar fact about Egypt is that it has little rain. The Nile River runs through this country for about 750 miles from the highlands of Ethiopia, overflowing its banks once a year during the summer solstice. As the Nile flows towards the sea, the water brings down alluvial deposits of black earth, making arable land on both sides of the Nile in the valley. The combination of fertile soil, the Nile as an irrigation canal, interacting with a hot climate, produced for Egypt huge quantities of corn and grain, which helped to feed a growing urban population and large armies. As a result of Egyptian prosperity, we find the ancient Hebrews going down to Egypt to purchase corn. The social scientists know that in order to achieve military expansion, economic development is a prerequisite, and Egypt has solved this problem early in its development. The yearly flooding of the Nile over its banks contributed a stimulus to learning, especially in astronomy and geometry. The priests wanted to calculate the exact period of the flooding of the Nile. In order to accomplish this, the priests had to observe the heavenly bodies. This involved mathematics, and they divided the year into 12 months of 30 days. Our calendar today is patterned after the Egyptian calendar. Again, because the Nile overflowed its banks, this event transformed the landmarks of the owners. Real estate had to be resurveyed, lines and angles drawn. This necessity led to the creation of geometry, which became also necessary in construction, engineering, and warfare. The Nile played a momentous role as a source of communication and transportation to hold together the union of Upper and Lower Egypt as one autonomous kingdom. The Egyptians of the north could engage in commerce with the south because strong winds during most of the year could push sailboats against the currents. The concentration of the people around the Nile was a phenomenon that encouraged ship construction and stimulated maritime trade with other nations in the Mediterranean Sea. This increased Egypt's naval forces, eventually in the Red Sea, and with all of the aforementioned factors operating for Egypt, she became a major power early in her development. The Old Kingdom. The history of the dynasties in the civilization of Egypt may be divided into three periods. They are as follows: the Old Kingdom or Pyramid Age, the Middle Kingdom, and the New Kingdom or New Empire. The first king of the first dynasty of the Old Kingdom was Menes. The date of his accession to the throne was about 3500 BC. He wore a unique double crown symbolizing the unity of Upper and Lower Egypt. The snake was the symbol in the north, and the hawk was the symbol in the south. By the time the third dynasty arrived, Egypt was well on her way toward greatness, 2980 to 2900 BC. The most remarkable king at this time was Zoser or Zoser. With his power, wealth, and the aid of his counselor Imhotep, he promoted the city of Memphis, expanded and strengthened the kingdom, built tombs, temples, and terraced pyramids. During the administration of King Zoser, there lived in Egypt the most phenomenal intellectual of his time. This man was Amenhotep, the master. He excelled in many academic pursuits and was preeminent in the field of medicine. J. A. Rogers says that he diagnosed and rendered therapy to more than 200 various diseases of the human body. The Egyptians practiced auscultation, the listening to sounds in the body, surgery, chemistry, and the recognition of diseases by their characteristics. Imhotep examined the internal and external vital organs of the systemic human body. Furthermore, he investigated the circulatory system. Herodotus says that the Egyptians were specialists in the medical field and the country swarmed with medical practitioners. In his day, Imhotep was recognized also as a sage, priest, philosopher, poet, scribe, magician, astronomer, and architect. Egyptian mythology. In the Egyptian pantheon, there were many gods. The most famous gods were Osiris, Isis, and Horus. These gods formed a triad. The principal gods were worshipped in a triad. The number three apparently had a mystical importance to the Egyptians. Horus was the son of the sun god, Osiris, and the moon goddess, Isis. The triad was very common in the ancient world, and it has come down to our day. Earlier, Osiris was the god of the Nile, and Isis represented the god of the earth. The Egyptians also worshipped the animals, nature, and the 12 gods. Hercules was one of these 12 gods. Herodotus, the Greek historian, says that the Greeks adopted the black god, Hercules, from the Egyptians. When the Greeks, Romans took over the gods of Asia and Africa, sometimes they changed their names and color. Let us return now to our triad, Osiris, Isis, and Horus. I think that more than any other god, the legend of Osiris underwent great transformation through the passage of history. At first, I am certain he was a subsidiary god, but he arose to the status of a sun god. In Egyptian mythology, the legend says Osiris was king of Egypt and he married his sister Isis. When Osiris went off to war, his brother, Set assassinated him. Set eventually cut the body in 14 pieces and scattered it over a remote area. Isis, undespairing, began a search for the fragments and found them except for the phallus, penis, which had been eaten by a Nile crab. Isis recomposed the body of her dead husband, skillfully connecting the parts together. She then effectuated the rites of embalmment, and this restored the body to eternal life. It was always considered in Egypt that the preservation of the body intact was necessary for the eternal life of the soul. Finally, Isis brought forth a son after the death of her husband. This posthumous birth was conceived by the union with her husband's dead body, miraculously reanimated by her charms. This mythology reminds one of the Spirit entering into the Virgin Mary, thus conceiving the child Jesus. Afterward, the goddess retreated to the marshland of Budo to flee from the anger of Set, who had usurped the throne, and to rear her son Horus until the day when he would be mature enough to avenge his father's death. According to another version, Set found out that Isis had given birth to Horus. Set entered the swamps in the form of a snake and bit Horus, leaving him on the verge of death. Finally, Isis was told that evil and darkness would persist until Horus was cured. Many kings of early Egypt were deified, ritually identified in the solar hierarchy as the sons of Ra. Ra remained the supreme god, and Osiris, Iris, and Horus, their son, was incorporated in the family of Ra, the solar pantheon. Some of the pharaohs were considered in the solar region to be either the incarnation of Horus the Elder, son of Ra, or the physical son of Ra himself. The connection of both Osiris and Isis with fertility cults was constantly emphasized from Empire Age onward, and this encouraged their gradual entry into the realm of the living. Osiris became the leader of this world and the underworld, and his name in the hieroglyph from the 20th dynasty onward was the solar disk rather than the eye. The stories and legends of ancient Egyptian mythology are voluminous and interesting. They have their counterparts in the East and West, Babylon, Greece, and Rome. From Greece and Rome, culture and civilization spread over the entire continent of Europe. Now, in order to terminate the history of the old kingdom, it behooves me to mention the fact that Khufu, the first king of the fourth Memphite dynasty, erected the largest pyramid. Pepi, the third and greatest king of the sixth dynasty, 2590 to 2570, sent some expeditions against the Bedouins or Bedouins of Sinai, or Bedouins of Sinai, and into Palestine. Nevertheless, Egypt was set for a period of decline. Pepi II reigned 90 years, 2566 through 2476 BC, the longest reign recorded in history, generally an uneventful period of retrogression, with the king much of the time controlled by a powerful aristocracy. The Old Kingdom and the first 1,000 years of recorded history ends with the Eighth Dynasty. This was the beginning of the period of excessive anarchy. The country was engaged in a destructive civil war. There was a long wrenched period of disorder. Many potentates claimed the throne at once, and the cities were in an uproar with widespread confusion. At this same time, black Hamitic Amorites from the northern Euphrates River invaded the Fertile Crescent and the Egyptian frontier. These Asiatic Amorites also penetrated the booming towns of the Nile Delta, spreading consternation and panic. The Middle Kingdom. The Middle Kingdom consisted of 9 dynasties lasting for a period of 1,000 years. Because of the condition of anarchy, the need of the hour was for strong leaders. This leadership was found in the 11th and 12th dynasties. Menhotep the second completed the conquest of the Heraclean dynasty. The capital of this kingdom was transferred more than 300 miles south of Memphis to the city of Thebes. Obviously, the capital was removed to Thebes so that it would be less subject to attack by Asiatic invaders. Once again, the mighty pharaohs governed Upper and Lower Egypt. When the new kings had restored law, order, and peace, the Egyptians devised more improvements and public works. Amenhet III of 12th dynasty, 1849 to 1801, and other pharaohs established dikes and constructed colossal reservoirs to preserve the water of the Nile for land irrigation. They dug a channel through the land between the Nile Delta and the Red Sea. The sophisticated Egyptians excavated canals thousands of years before a French engineer, de Lesseps, dug the Suez Canal, AD 1869. The ancient Egyptians were meticulous masters in constructional engineering. They were very accurate with the smallest details. Thousands of slaves from all over are from all over the known world were forced under harsh regimentation and strict rule to construct temples, monuments, and pyramids for the megalomatic, deified pharaohs. The 12th dynasty appeared on the international scene as a strongly organized monarchy. The kings had diplomatic relations with remote kingdoms Ses- So- Sesostris III, fifth king of the dynasty, 1887 to 1849 BC, conquered 200 miles of the Nile Valley up to the Second Cataract. He established relations with the coast of the Red Sea. He sent military expeditions into the Sinai Peninsula and also into Syria. At this time, trade was successful on a large scale. During the Middle Kingdom, Egyptian civilization made its first profound influence on other parts of Africa, such as Nubia, Wawat, Kush, etc. About the time of the reign of Amenemhet IV, 1801 to 1792 BC, and the early stages of the 13th dynasty, Egypt went through a long period of confusion and invasion. The Egyptians were so tremendously dismal that they neglected the defense of the kingdom. It collapsed easily about 1787 BC before a wave of invaders known as Hy- Hyksos, Hyksos, or shepherd kings. These Hyksos dominated Egypt for about 200 years. This period is known to the Egyptians as the Great Humiliation. Now, after long, exhaustive investigation, it appears that the Hyksos were descendants of the ancient Hurrites or Hurrians. A.T. Olmsted confesses that there is much obscurity about their race. We may at least assert that they were West Semites and that their chief center of power was North Syria. I do not agree with Olmsted when he says they are Semites. However, much evidence indicates when evidence indicates that they are Japhites, Indo-Iranians, or Indo-Europeans, descendants of what we call today the white race. But I agree with Olmsted when he says the center of their power was in North Syria. The Hurrians came from the southern parts of the Caucasus Mountains and established their new capital at Mitanni in Syria and Assyria. These Hurrians began to push their way into the black world of the Middle East about 1800 BC. Herbert Wendt writes the following: in ancient Sumerian epics, the land of Churam is mentioned south of the Caucasus, and in the Old Testament, the Hurrians appear as the Chori or Horites. In 1720 BC, or thereabouts, they conquered, under the name of Hyksos, the kingdom of Egypt, where they reigned as shepherd kings. When the Hurrians invaded the Middle East, they were a white or fair-skinned race. They mixed with the indigenous black population, and took up permanent residence among them. Everywhere they traveled, they established colonies. During the second millennium, the Hurrians invaded Egypt under the name Hyksos. They came with horses and chariots, which terrified the Egyptians. The Egyptians had never seen horses before. and the Egyptians probably had never before seen such a heterogeneous population of white, yellow, light brown, and chocolate people. So the Hyksos came into Egypt and established the 15th and 16th dynasties. These dynasties are known to the Egyptians as the period of the Great Humiliation. During this period, the Egyptians had to suffer insults to their gods and culture from aliens. Many scholars think that the Hyksos were in power in Egypt when the ancient Hebrews came down to live and to purchase corn. This would mean that the Hebrews migrated to Egypt between 1788 and 1580. The Hyksos were hospitable to the Hebrews because they were aliens themselves. It was one of the Hyksos pharaohs who elevated Joseph, the wise Hebrew, to the position of victory in Egypt. Because of this, Joseph saved Egypt from starvation. In the process of time, the Egyptians from the city of Thebes, Upper Egypt, waged wars of liberation against the Hyksos. The new powerful native Egyptian leader advocated an ardent nationalist policy to regain control of the government. As a result, the Hyksos were expelled from Egypt. The new kingdom or empire. Now there arose up a new king over Egypt, which knew not Joseph. And he said unto his people, Behold, the people of the children of Israel are more mightier than we. Come on, let us deal wisely with them, lest they multiply, and it come to pass, when there falleth out any war, they join also unto our enemies, and fight against us, and so get them up out of the land. Much proof points to the fact that the new Pharaoh who ascended the throne was Amos or Ames, Amos I or Ames, the first king of the brilliant 18th dynasty, 1580 through 1557 BC. He reestablished the government at Thebes, expelled the Hyksos, and instituted something like a fascist form of government. This government was an autocratic nationalist regime, exercising regimentation of industry, rigid censorship, and forcible suppression of opposition. The period of this nationalist dynasty marked a turning point in the fortunes of the Hebrews. They were once well thought of by the overthrown Hyksos kings. Now they lost their favored status, and their previous contributions to the nation were ignored. Their freedom of movement was restricted. The male genocide was decreed, and gradually the Hebrews were reduced to slavery. Therefore, they did set over them taskmasters to afflict them with their burdens. And they built for Pharaoh treasure cities, Pithom and Ramses. But the more they afflicted them, the more they multiplied and grew, and they were grieved because of the children of Israel. And they made their lives bitter with hard bondage in mortar and brick, and in all manner of service in the field, and all their service wherein they made them serve was with rigor. And the king of Egypt spake to the Hebrew midwives, of which the name of one was Shiphrah, and the name of the other Puah. And he said, when ye do the office of a midwife to the Hebrew women, and see them upon the stools, if it be a son, then ye shall kill him, but if it be a daughter, then she shall live. During the period that the Hebrews were slaves for Pharaoh, they built many of the megalithic structures for the Hebrews. The Hebrews erected some pyramids. They dug a great many channels for the river. They built walls for the cities and ramparts. They constructed the halls at Karnak for Tutmos I. They built temple pylons, hypostyle halls, and an obelisk for Amenhotep III. By the edict of Ramses II, they constructed at Thebes the temple of the Ramseum with its colossal statues of himself, and they built the treasure cities of Pithom and Ramses. Naturally, the Hebrews were not the only slaves in Egypt. They were Ethiopian slaves, or there were Ethiopian slaves, Nubians, Canaanites, Syrians, and people from the Aegean islands. But the Hebrew slaves were in the majority. The New Kingdom or New Empire age consisted of the most remarkable and outstanding black personalities known, not only in Egypt, but in the entire civilized world. They were brilliant men, possessed with gallantry and the capability to recognize the civil and military administrations. After the Asiatic invaders had humiliated the Egyptians, the people rapidly forgot their phobias of horses and learned to use chariots. They manufactured sophisticated weapons out of iron. The generals organized horsemen and other soldiers into mighty expeditionary forces to conquer Syria, Mitanni, and the territory extending to the fourth cataract of the Nile. In the year 1501 BC, the fourth king of the 18th dynasty enthroned himself. He was Thutmose III, known as the Hornet, because he wore this insignia on his crown. Thutmose III was the son of Thutmose I and a concubine, Isis. His qualities of face were pure ink black, broad nose, and thick lips. He reigned jointly with his wife and half sister, Queen Hatshepsut, ruled alone, 1481 through 1447 BC. Thutmose was one of the greatest Egyptian kings. He began his rule by deposing his father in a palace revolution, but with his queen was temporarily pushed aside by the revolution of Thutmose I, his father, and II, his brother. Eventually, He regained control of the government, invaded Syria with a great army, 1479, defeated the king of Kadesh at Megiddo. Tutmos III really lived up to his reputation as the Flying Hornet. He waged 17 military campaigns in Asia. His navy conquered the islands of the Aegean Sea and aided and added them to his colossal empire. Akhenaton, or Amenhotep IV. Many years after the death of Tutmos III, a new king called Amenhotep IV became a religious innovator. He was not an excellent soldier or governor. He believed in one god, the sun god, Aten, who dominated all living creatures. Because he was excessively preoccupied with religion, he neglected the kingdom. He ordered that the temples of the old Egyptian gods be closed, and he expelled the priesthood. Also, he changed his name from Amenhotep to Akhenaton, which means Aten is satisfied. He transferred his capital from Thebes to Tel El Amarna. When Akhenaton attempted to revolutionize the religion, this act divided the Egyptian aristocracy and weakened the government. Furthermore, Akhenaton was too busy to send military assistance to the Egyptian allies or to remote countries of the empire which were threatened by revolt or invasion.